Welcome back. If you enjoy these long, quiet journeys into the stranger corners of history, you can like the video, subscribe if you'd like more, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Tonight, we are going beneath Cappadocia. Not into a tomb, not into a mine, and not into a single cave, but into a place where people once built rooms, storage spaces, stables, wells, churches, ventilation shafts, and defensive barriers deep inside the earth. And almost immediately, Derinkuyu presents us with a contradiction. People went underground to be safer. Yet the deeper they went, the more dependent they became on fragile things: air, water, lamp fuel, narrow passages, hidden entrances, and doors that could protect them only by closing them in. So the question is not simply why they dug. The more interesting question is what made the surface feel worse. Today, Derinkuyu is usually introduced as an ancient underground city in central Turkey, carved into the soft volcanic rock of Cappadocia. It descends through multiple levels, contains a remarkable network of rooms and passages, and reaches roughly 85 meters below the surface at its deepest known extent. That figure sounds impressive in the abstract, but depth is easier to understand when we think about what disappears as we go down. First, the open air, then the sky, then ordinary daylight, then weather, then distance, then the easy knowledge of what is happening outside. By the time you are deep inside a place like Derinkuyu, the world above has become something you no longer directly experience. You depend on whatever reaches you through shafts, passages, messages, and sound. That is part of what makes the site so compelling. It is not just underground architecture. It is architecture built around the possibility that normal life above could suddenly become unavailable. The origins of Derinkuyu are uncertain, and that uncertainty matters because popular versions of the story often make the city sound much neater than the evidence allows. There is no surviving inscription saying that one ruler ordered its construction in one particular year. There is no single agreed answer to the question of who first began carving its earliest spaces. Different theories have linked early excavation to different ancient populations, while later use and expansion are much more clearly associated with Christian communities of the Byzantine period. The safest way to understand the site is not as one enormous project created all at once, but as something that grew in stages. A room becomes 2 rooms. A storage space becomes a refuge. A refuge becomes more defensible. More people use it. More ventilation is needed. More water access is needed. More connections are cut. And over time, something ordinary can become enormous. That process is easier to understand once we look at Cappadocia itself. The landscape was shaped by volcanic activity, leaving behind layers of tuff, a rock that can be comparatively easy to carve while still remaining strong enough to hold many excavated spaces without collapsing. That is an unusual advantage. In many places, carving a room beneath the ground would require extraordinary effort. Here, it could be practical, and once practical underground space already exists, using it for more than one purpose becomes almost inevitable. A cool chamber can store food. Another can hold wine. Animals can be sheltered. Valuable goods can be kept away from heat or theft. A household already accustomed to cutting into rock does not need to invent the idea of going underground during danger. The idea is already there. What changes is the reason. There is evidence that underground habitation was not unfamiliar in ancient Anatolia. Xenophon, writing in the 4th century BCE, described subterranean dwellings in the region that could shelter both people and animals. That does not prove he was describing Derinkuyu itself, and it should not be treated as if it does. But it tells us that life below ground was not necessarily viewed as something bizarre or impossible. People already understood that excavated spaces could be useful. So the great mystery is not really why did anyone ever think of digging down? The mystery begins when useful underground rooms become part of a defensive system. At some point, the underground is no longer just convenient. It becomes safer than being seen. That shift tells us something important about the kind of danger people were facing. A wall protects a place by making it harder to enter. A tower protects a place by allowing defenders to see farther. A fortress is built to resist attention. Derinkuyu uses another principle: disappearance. If attackers are stronger than you, defeating them may not be realistic. Hiding from them may be. A farming community cannot easily move its fields, its houses, or its orchards. But people can move themselves. Animals can sometimes be brought below. Food can be stored. Valuables can disappear. Entrances can be concealed. And the surface, for a time, can appear strangely empty. That is not the heroic side of warfare. It is the civilian side. The goal is not to win a battle. The goal is to remain alive until the danger has gone somewhere else. And once we frame Derinkuyu that way, many of its strangest features begin to make sense. The narrow corridors, for example, are uncomfortable. Some passages are low enough that a modern visitor must stoop. At first glance, this seems like poor design. Then the defensive logic appears. A narrow passage slows movement. It prevents a large group from advancing together. It forces an unfamiliar attacker into awkward positions. Someone who already knows the route has an advantage over someone entering in darkness for the first time. The inconvenience is shared, but not equally. The residents live with it. The intruder discovers it under pressure. The same is true of the famous circular stone doors. These large stone barriers could be rolled or moved into position to block passages from the inside. They are often presented as one of Derinkuyu's most ingenious features, and they are. But they also reveal something uncomfortable. A hidden entrance was not considered enough. Someone had to imagine the possibility that an enemy might get inside. That means the defense did not depend on one boundary. It depended on layers. If one part of the refuge was compromised, another could still be sealed. This is not the architecture of absolute safety. It is the architecture of buying time. And time, in a raid, can be the difference between capture and survival. The stone door itself contains another contradiction. From one side, it is protection. From the other, it is confinement. Once a passage is sealed, the people behind it are safer from whoever may be outside, but they are also more dependent on everything already inside. Water matters more. Air matters more. Food matters more. Information matters more. The deeper the retreat, the fewer easy options remain. This is what makes Derinkuyu more interesting than a simple hidden cave. The city does not merely remove people from danger. It creates a second environment with its own risks. The people using it exchanged one kind of uncertainty for another. Above ground, they might face attack. Below ground, they faced darkness, crowding, limited movement, dependence on ventilation, the difficulty of moving animals, and the question of how long they might need to remain there. That trade only makes sense if the danger above was serious enough. And we know that Cappadocia did experience long periods of insecurity, especially during the medieval centuries when the region sat within a wider zone of conflict between Byzantine and Arab powers. It is important not to turn that into one neat invasion story. Derinkuyu was not necessarily built because one army appeared once. The more significant pattern is repetition. Repeated raids, repeated warnings, repeated uncertainty. That kind of danger changes behavior differently from a single catastrophe. A single event can be remembered. Recurring danger can be planned for. The first time people hide, there is confusion. The next time, someone remembers what worked. Soon the route is known. Supplies are stored more intelligently. The animals are easier to move because people have done it before. The entrance stays clear. The stone door is maintained. The emergency becomes a procedure, and that may be the first real answer to the paradox. Derinkuyu probably did not begin because one civilization became overwhelmed by one unimaginable terror. It may have grown because ordinary people repeatedly discovered that the same solution worked. Go down, bring what you can, close the passage. Wait, then return when the surface is safe again. Over generations, this kind of behavior can become almost mundane. That is difficult for us to picture, because we encounter Derinkuyu as visitors. For us, the underground is the strange part. For the people who depended on it, the truly strange thing may have been the moment when the surface could no longer be trusted. A family could spend most of its life above ground. Fields still needed sunlight. Animals still needed grazing. Trade still followed roads. Children still grew up in the open air. The underground was not a replacement for ordinary life. It was what ordinary life kept in reserve. And that reserve came with a price. Even before we think about food, sickness, or sanitation, there is the simple, physical act of moving downward. People have to carry what matters. Containers, lamps, oil, food, perhaps bedding, perhaps tools. Children may need help. Older people may move slowly. Animals may refuse narrow entrances. Every step adds friction. The underground city may look impressive from a distance, but every meter of passage was something a real body had to move through. This is where the scale becomes human. A tunnel is not simply 60 meters long. It is a route someone walked while carrying weight. A staircase is not simply an architectural feature. It is something an elderly person had to descend. A stable is not simply evidence of livestock. It means somebody had to persuade animals to go where animals may not have wanted to go. And once people were inside, the most valuable resources were often invisible. Air, for example. Derinkuyu contains an extensive ventilation system, and that fact alone tells us how far the settlement had moved beyond a simple emergency cave. A few people can shelter underground for a short time without elaborate planning. A large population cannot. People breathe. Animals breathe. Lamps consume oxygen. Fires produce smoke. Heat gathers. Air must move. The deeper the refuge, the more important this becomes. Ventilation shafts made prolonged use possible, but they also created another dependency on the surface. To hide successfully, the refuge needed to be sealed enough to protect people. To keep them alive, it could never be completely sealed. Water created a similar problem. Derinkuyu had access to wells, which meant that people were less dependent on carrying every drop down from above. That greatly increased the practical value of the refuge. But wells need protection. Water needs distribution. Animals need more of it. A large, sheltered population turns water from something ordinary into logistics. And logistics is where grand architecture becomes daily work. Someone fills the container. Someone carries it. Someone spills some. Someone has to go back. Someone waits. There is nothing dramatic about any of this. That is precisely why it matters. Long-term survival is usually decided by repetitive tasks long before it is decided by dramatic events. The same is true of light. Modern visitors see Derinkuyu under electric illumination, but ancient inhabitants did not. Their world would have been defined by small flames. A lamp gives enough light to see nearby faces, walls, and steps, while everything beyond its range disappears. That means the underground city would not have been visually experienced as one enormous connected place. It would have been experienced in pieces. A room, a corridor, a doorway, another pool of light, then darkness again. People who knew the routes could move with confidence. A stranger could not. Familiarity itself became part of the defense. And over time, that familiarity must have changed the emotional experience of the place. Unknown darkness is unsettling. Known darkness is different. A child raised around the passages could learn them the way another child learns the route through a courtyard or between neighbouring houses. The low ceiling becomes the place where you duck. The narrow bend becomes the turn before the storage room. The strange underground world becomes a map. This may be one of the most important things to understand about Derinkuyu. Its effectiveness depended not only on stone and engineering, but on memory. People had to know how to use it, which route led where animals went, where water could be found, which passage could be sealed, which spaces were deeper and safer. A refuge that nobody understands is almost useless. A refuge used across generations becomes powerful because the people themselves carry the instructions. That is when fear begins to turn into culture, not necessarily into ritual, not into constant anxiety, into habit. The entrance stays clear because it may be needed. The route is remembered because forgetting it would be foolish. Children are shown where to go. A chamber remains stocked because once, long ago, somebody needed it. And eventually, people may continue doing these things without knowing exactly when the first decision was made. That is how enormous systems often survive. Rules last longer than explanations. The people who built Derinkuyu may never have thought of themselves as constructing a mysterious underground civilization. They may simply have been solving one practical problem after another. A room is too small. A passage is too exposed. The air is poor. The water is too far away. The entrance is weak. Another chamber is needed. Then another generation inherits the work and adds its own solution. Centuries pass. The result looks deliberate in a way the process may never have been. And this is why the central question changes as soon as we spend a little time inside it. At first, Derinkuyu seems to ask, who could possibly build this? A little later, the more revealing question becomes, how many times did people have to need it before it became this large? That question takes us away from the rock and toward the human world that kept returning to it. Because the true story of Derinkuyu is not simply the story of digging down, it is the story of what happened when danger above became familiar enough that going below no longer felt extraordinary. Long before Derinkuyu became a place of refuge, the people of Cappadocia had already learned something useful about the ground beneath their feet. It could be worked. That simple fact is easy to lose beneath the scale of what came later. When we see photographs of underground chambers descending level after level, connected by tunnels and shafts, the instinct is to imagine an enormous construction project, beginning with an equally enormous decision. Yet the landscape itself suggests a slower and much more practical beginning. Cappadocia was shaped by volcanic activity over immense stretches of time. Eruptions deposited layers of ash and other volcanic material across the region, and some of those deposits eventually formed the relatively soft rock known as tuff. Wind, water, temperature, and erosion then worked on those layers from above, producing the strange valleys and formations for which Cappadocia is famous today. Humans discovered another quality from below. The rock could be cut. Freshly exposed tuff can be considerably easier to work than many harder stones, while still being capable, under the right conditions, of supporting excavated rooms and passages. That combination gave local communities an unusual architectural opportunity. Instead of placing every useful space on the landscape, they could also place some of it inside the landscape. At first, there need not have been anything mysterious about this. A chamber cut into rock could provide storage. Temperatures underground were less exposed to the daily extremes experienced outside. Food, grain, wine, and other supplies could benefit from such conditions. Animals could be sheltered in excavated spaces. Over centuries, Cappadocia developed an extensive tradition of rock-cut architecture that eventually included houses, churches, monasteries, storerooms, and defensive refuges. The important point is that underground construction did not need to begin with an enemy. It could begin with a household problem. You have food and need somewhere to keep it. You have wine and want a stable place to store it. You need another room, but rather than building outward, you can cut inward. the work was still work. Calling the stone comparatively soft does not mean chambers appeared effortlessly. Someone had to remove the material with tools, carry the debris away, shape openings, and judge how much rock could safely be removed. Expanding a chamber meant producing a remarkable quantity of spoil that had to go somewhere. Yet once the technique was understood, the possibilities multiplied. A family that already had a useful excavated room did not need to invent subterranean architecture when circumstances changed. It merely had to find a new use for something familiar. And circumstances in Anatolia changed often. This is where the question of Derinkuyu's age becomes difficult. Popular accounts sometimes offer confident answers. One version credits the Hittites, another points to the Phrygians. Others describe Derinkuyu primarily as the work of early Christians. It is possible that some excavated spaces in the region have very ancient origins, and there is good evidence that subterranean habitation existed in Anatolia long before the medieval period. But Derinkuyu is not an object that can simply be picked up, dated, and placed neatly on a museum shelf. It is a place that was altered. Suppose a chamber was cut in 1 century, enlarged 2 centuries later, connected to another space centuries after that, and finally adapted for religious or defensive use much later. An object left during the final phase tells us when people were there. It does not necessarily tell us when the first tools struck the wall. This is why the most responsible answer to the question, who built Derinkuyu, is less satisfying than the popular one. We do not know exactly who began it, and there may never have been one group that deserves the entire credit. The underground complex we recognize today is better understood as the product of multiple phases of excavation and reuse, with substantial development associated with the Christian communities of the Byzantine era. There is an older clue, however, that tells us something important about the wider tradition. In the 4th century BCE, the Greek writer and soldier Xenophon described underground dwellings encountered during his journey through Anatolia. In his account, entrances descended into spaces where people, animals, and provisions could be kept below ground. It is an appealing description, and for that reason it is sometimes pulled directly into the story of Derinkuyu. We should resist that temptation. Xenophon did not leave us a sign saying, in effect, "I have just visited the place modern people call Derinkuyu." His description cannot securely date this particular underground city. What it does establish is more useful anyway. People in ancient Anatolia already knew how to use underground spaces for ordinary life. By the time the later defensive systems of Cappadocia developed, the basic idea was not revolutionary. The skills existed, the landscape permitted them, the habit existed. What changed was scale and purpose. At some point, a storage space that was useful during peace became useful during danger, and this may have happened in the simplest possible way. If armed men were approaching and a family already possessed a concealed room beneath the ground, going into it required no architectural theory. You went where you could not easily be seen. If that worked once, the lesson was obvious. The next time, you might be better prepared. More food could be stored there. The entrance could be improved. A neighbouring space could be connected. A vulnerable opening could be narrowed. The shelter could be made large enough for more people. One adaptation encourages another because every improvement reveals the next weakness. A larger chamber holds more people, but more people require more air. Better concealment protects the entrance, but people remaining longer need reliable water. A deeper refuge provides greater separation from the surface, but reaching it becomes harder. Bringing animals below protects valuable livestock, but animals need space, ventilation, water, and waste management. The refuge becomes more capable and more complicated at the same time. That is how Derinkuyu begins to make sense without requiring a master plan. Its sophistication may have emerged because each generation inherited solutions and then encountered new problems. We should also be careful with the word city. It is useful and everyone uses it, but it can create the wrong mental picture. When we hear city, we tend to picture permanent urban life transferred underground, thousands of people waking each morning, conducting business, raising families, and spending their entire lives without seeing the sky. The evidence does not require that interpretation. Derinkuyu was capable of sheltering a large population, and estimates sometimes suggest that thousands of people, possibly as many as around 20,000 at maximum capacity, could have used the complex. But capacity is not the same thing as a permanent census. The stronger interpretation is that Derinkuyu functioned primarily as a refuge, alongside other practical uses, rather than as a subterranean metropolis whose population had simply abandoned the surface. That distinction makes the site more understandable. Agricultural communities could not permanently separate themselves from the land above. Crops needed tending, livestock needed grazing, trade needed roads. People needed access to surrounding settlements. Daily life belonged mostly to the surface. The underground was valuable because it offered a second option when ordinary life became dangerous. And a second option changes the way people experience risk. Consider the difference between a family living in an exposed settlement with nowhere to go and one living above a known refuge. The threat may be identical. The response is not. The second family has a decision to make. When do we leave the house? What do we take? How much warning do we need? That sounds reassuring until we notice that having a refuge creates its own uncertainty. Go down too early, and you may spend uncomfortable hours, perhaps days, hiding from a danger that never arrives. Go down too late, and the entire system may become useless. This is why warning mattered. Cappadocia sits within a landscape where routes, valleys, settlements, and open terrain could carry both travellers and threats. News could move ahead of violence, although not always reliably. A report from another settlement, movement seen at a distance, or information carried along a road might give people time to react. But pre-modern information was imperfect. A rumour could be wrong. A threat could change direction. A group seen in the distance might not be coming toward you. People had to make decisions without knowing the ending. And once a refuge exists, caution becomes easier to justify. The cost of a false alarm is inconvenience. The cost of ignoring a real one can be enormous. That imbalance encourages people to act before certainty arrives. This is one way emergency behavior becomes routine. You do not wait to see an attacker at your door. By then, the underground city has already failed at its most important job. You move while there is still time to move, and movement itself would have been a complicated business. The beautiful archaeological plan disappears as soon as actual bodies enter it. An older person moves more slowly than a young adult. A small child cannot carry much. A household with several containers of grain has to decide what can realistically be moved. Animals complicate everything. A goat may be manageable. A larger animal in a narrow entrance is another matter. This helps explain why stable areas were placed relatively high in the complex. Taking livestock deep through constricted passages would have created unnecessary difficulty, while keeping them nearer the upper levels allowed animals to be protected without forcing them through every part of the refuge. The placement also limited some of the problems animals created for the human population deeper inside. They produced heat, moisture, waste, noise, and considerable demand for air. Once again, an architectural feature that seems like a simple label on a plan's stable reveals a chain of practical decisions. The animals were there because leaving them outside could destroy a family's livelihood. They were kept nearer the top because taking them farther down created new problems. The refuge was therefore organized partly around the limits of bodies. Human bodies as well. Some of Derinkuyu's corridors are strikingly narrow, and their dimensions have often been interpreted in defensive terms. If you know the passage, you can move through it carefully. If you are an attacker entering an unfamiliar underground complex, the experience is very different. You cannot advance shoulder to shoulder. You cannot easily bring large numbers of people forward. You may have to bend. Your view ahead is limited. The people defending the space know where the passage ends. You do not. This is one of the cleverest things about the defensive system, because it does not require the inhabitants to be militarily stronger than the people pursuing them. The architecture changes the terms. Numbers become less useful in a narrow corridor. Speed becomes less useful. Familiarity becomes more useful. A local farmer who would have little chance against a trained armed group in an open field has a very different advantage inside a passage that he knows and they do not. The enormous circular stone barriers took this logic further. Placed at strategic points, they could close passages from the interior, creating additional defensive boundaries after people had already entered the complex. Their existence tells us that concealment alone was not trusted. Whoever developed these defensive features understood that entrances might be discovered. If that happened, there needed to be another obstacle and another protected area behind it. Derinkuyu therefore offered defense through depth. The deeper an attacker attempted to penetrate, the more unfamiliar and constrained the environment became. For the inhabitants, however, depth came with a price. Every step away from the surface increased dependence on the systems built into the refuge. This is where one of the most impressive features of Derinkuyu becomes important: ventilation. The complex includes vertical shafts capable of carrying air through multiple levels. One major shaft descends deep into the underground system, with chambers and passages arranged around access to ventilation. This was essential. A shallow hiding place used by a few people for a short period can tolerate crude airflow. A refuge expected to hold large numbers of people cannot. People consume oxygen. Animals consume oxygen. Lamps and fires consume oxygen. Cooking creates smoke. Without adequate circulation, the underground space designed to protect its occupants becomes dangerous itself. Water presented the same problem in another form. A short stay can be supplied by what people carry. A prolonged stay requires something better. Derinkuyu included wells and underground access to water, allowing occupants to reduce their dependence on exposed surface sources. These systems tell us something about intention. The people expanding Derinkuyu were not preparing merely to duck underground for an hour while danger passed. They were creating a refuge capable of supporting people for substantially longer periods when necessary. That required anticipating needs before the emergency began: air, water, food storage, animals, movement, defense. The underground city gradually became a machine for extending the amount of time a community could remain invisible. And time was the crucial resource. Most raiders could not remain indefinitely. An invading force needed supplies of its own. Horses needed feeding. Soldiers needed food. Military objectives lay elsewhere. If a community could avoid detection or remain inaccessible long enough, the threat might eventually move on. This is what makes hiding strategically rational. The defenders did not necessarily have to drive anyone away. They could wait for the outside world to change. Of course, waiting underground created the next set of problems. The architecture could provide air and water. It could make attack difficult. It could conceal people. What it could not do was make a crowded human population stop being human. People still became hungry. Children still became restless. Animals still produced waste. Lamps still needed fuel. Illness did not pause because the doors were closed. And the longer a refuge worked exactly as intended, the more important these ordinary problems became. That is the peculiar logic of Derinkuyu. Its defensive engineering was successful only if it gave people enough time to face an entirely different enemy, the difficulty of living together underground. And by then, the landscape that had made all of this possible was no longer the main story. The rock had provided the opportunity. Human danger had changed its purpose. What remained was the much more intimate question of how thousands of ordinary people could actually endure the place they had built to save them. The rock made Derinkuyu possible, but geology alone does not explain why anyone would keep expanding it. For that, we have to return to the surface and look at what was happening across Cappadocia during the centuries when underground refuges became particularly valuable. By the early medieval period, Cappadocia lay within the Byzantine world, in a region repeatedly affected by conflict between the Byzantine Empire and expanding Arab powers. From roughly the 7th century onward, warfare along the eastern frontier brought raids and military incursions into parts of Anatolia, and the danger did not arrive as one single invasion with a convenient beginning and end. It returned. That distinction is crucial. If a village is attacked once in a century, people may rebuild and remember the event as a disaster. If raids become a recurring possibility, people begin changing the way they prepare for life. The underground refuges of Cappadocia make the most sense in that second world. This does not mean everyone lived in constant terror, watching the horizon every morning. Agricultural communities could not function that way. Fields still had to be planted and harvested, animals still needed grazing, goods still moved along roads, and families continued with the ordinary business of living. But peace could contain the expectation that it might be interrupted. That expectation is enough to change architecture. A farmer did not need to defeat an army. A family did not need to hold a fortified wall against professional soldiers. In many situations, confronting an armed raiding force would have been the worst possible choice. The underground offered another strategy. Do not meet them, disappear. For civilians, this could be far more sensible than resistance. Raids threatened more than immediate physical injury. Livestock could be taken. Stored food could be seized. People could be captured or enslaved. Houses and crops could be damaged. Families could be separated. A person looking across a field at approaching armed men did not need to understand the larger political conflict to understand what might be lost. This is where the enormous scale of empires shrinks down to something very small. A child, a sack of grain, a few animals, a house, enough food to reach the next harvest. These were things an ordinary family could actually lose. And some of them could be taken underground. The strategy was imperfect from the beginning. You could hide people, but not fields. You could move some food, but not an entire harvest still growing. You could protect livestock only if there was enough warning to bring it in. A house remained exactly where it had always been. Derinkuyu could not prevent destruction. It could prevent destruction from becoming total. That is a less dramatic form of defense than winning a battle. But for the people involved, it was probably much more useful. If the family survived, animals survived, and enough food remained, life could be rebuilt. This may also explain why underground refuge systems were useful even when attackers knew such places existed. Complete secrecy was valuable, but it was not the only defense. Once an entrance was found, the structure itself became hostile to anyone unfamiliar with it. The narrow passages we encountered earlier now acquire their full purpose. An attacker moving through one cannot easily see what lies around the next turn. Numbers become less useful when only one or two people can advance comfortably at a time. Weapons designed for open movement may become awkward. The person entering has to negotiate unfamiliar steps and low ceilings while moving toward defenders who know exactly where the passage leads. Then there are the stone doors. Some of the circular barriers at Derinkuyu could be moved across passageways from within sealing sections of the complex. Their design allowed the inhabitants to create defensive choke points after retreating deeper underground. The interesting part is not simply that the doors were heavy, it is where they were useful. A door inside the complex means the first line of defense has already failed. The entrance has been discovered. Someone has come far enough in that another boundary is needed. This tells us something about the mentality behind the architecture. The builders were not assuming perfect concealment. They were planning for things to go wrong. That is a much more sophisticated kind of preparation. Good defensive systems rarely depend on everything working perfectly. They assume mistakes, bad luck, discovery, and failure, then try to make each failure survivable. If one entrance is compromised, another section may remain protected. If attackers reach one level, a deeper area may still be closed. The refuge buys distance, obstacles, confusion, and, above all, time. There is evidence of other underground settlements and refuges across Cappadocia, which makes Derinkuyu less of an isolated mystery and more part of a regional response to recurring insecurity. That changes the question again. If only one enormous underground site existed, we might search for one extraordinary local event. When similar strategies appear across a wider landscape, the explanation is more likely to lie in conditions people repeatedly shared. Cappadocia was not full of people independently developing an eccentric passion for dark corridors. Underground refuge worked. The landscape allowed it, and history gave communities reasons to use it. Some settlements developed particularly extensive systems. Others were smaller. The precise chronology varies and remains debated, but the broader behavior is more revealing than any single date. People repeatedly invested labor in making themselves difficult to reach. This also helps explain why the term secret city can be slightly misleading. The entrances may have been concealed, and secrecy certainly increased their value, but these places were not secret from the communities that maintained them. They were local infrastructure. People had to know about them. Someone had to maintain access. Someone had to understand the ventilation. Storage areas had to be used. Animals had to be brought into appropriate spaces. Defensive doors had to remain operable. A completely forgotten refuge is not a useful refuge. The secret was not that the underground existed. The secret was how to reach the people inside it. And that required a remarkable reversal of normal settlement logic. On the surface, a prosperous community usually makes itself more visible over time. More buildings appear, paths become established, fields expand, smoke rises, animals gather, trade brings strangers. Success leaves evidence. During a raid, all of those signs become liabilities. The same path that helps a merchant find the village can help an armed group find it. The same food stores that protect a family against winter attract people who want to take them. The same livestock that represents wealth can be driven away by someone else. Ordinary prosperity creates targets. So when danger approached, the community attempted something deeply unnatural for a settled society. It tried to erase itself. Fires above might be abandoned. Movement stopped. People left houses. Animals disappeared from their usual places. The useful signs of settlement became things to suppress. The surface did not need to look completely untouched. Raiders were not foolish, and houses could hardly be made invisible. But an empty settlement offered fewer immediate rewards than one full of people, animals, and accessible stores. More importantly, the inhabitants themselves were no longer easy to seize. This strategy works best when the attacker is temporary. That is important. An army intending to occupy a settlement permanently can search, wait, destroy, and control access for a long time. A mobile raiding force operates under different pressures. It must continue moving, feed itself, manage animals, carry what it has taken, and pursue whatever larger objective brought it into the region. The hidden population is making a wager. The attackers will leave before the refuge becomes unbearable. And that means the real defensive weapon is not stone. It is patience. The inhabitants do not need to win. They need to remain below longer than the danger remains above. This sounds simple until we consider what waiting requires. Every additional day consumes food. Every additional day consumes lamp fuel. People need water. Animals need water. Waste accumulates. The air has to remain usable. Anyone who becomes ill must be cared for. A minor injury becomes more irritating in a narrow environment. Children have to be occupied. People who are frightened have to sleep eventually. So the defensive contest has an invisible clock on both sides. Outside, the attackers cannot remain forever. Inside, neither can the refugees. Whoever reaches their practical limit first changes the situation. The underground architecture was designed to push that limit farther away. Ventilation extends it. Water extends it. Food storage extends it. Protected livestock extends the community's ability to recover afterward. Defensive barriers make searching more expensive. Depth makes penetration slower. Each feature adds time, and this may be the simplest way to understand why Derinkuyu grew so extensive. Depth was stored time. A shallow cave might protect a family for a few hours. A sophisticated refuge with air, water, food, animals, and defensible passages could make hiding practical for much longer. The builders were not merely digging away from the surface. They were increasing the amount of time they could afford not to return to it. The Byzantine Arab frontier gives this system its strongest historical context, but we should resist making every chamber a direct response to one particular group of attackers. Underground spaces were used and modified over long periods. Different generations faced different dangers. A structure created or enlarged for one crisis can easily be reused during another. That is one of the advantages of digging into stone. The enemy may change. The room remains. This is where history begins accumulating inside Derinkuyu. One generation learns that a particular passage is useful. The next inherits it without paying the original cost of excavation. Adding another chamber is easier than beginning an entirely new refuge. A defensive feature can be improved. Storage can be expanded. A religious space can be added as the needs of the community change. Architecture begins carrying knowledge across generations. And eventually, nobody using the oldest part of the system needs to know exactly who first cut it. They only need to know that it works. This is probably closer to the real story than the image of an ancient architect designing an 18-level underground city on a plan. The famous number of levels itself should be treated carefully. Modern popular accounts often describe Derinkuyu as having 18 underground levels, while only a portion of the entire complex is accessible, and the precise organization of its deepest spaces is more complicated than a neat stack of floors. Ancient excavation did not have to follow the logic of a modern building. People followed useful rock, existing spaces, shafts, connections, practical needs. The resulting underground world is irregular because it grew rather than simply being assembled, and growth leaves traces of changing priorities. Nearer the upper levels, spaces associated with animals make practical sense. Taking large livestock deeper than necessary would make movement harder. Farther in, storage and living or refuge spaces could be protected. Water and ventilation had to serve multiple levels. Religious areas reflect communities doing more than simply crouching in darkness until an alarm ended. The deeper the system became, the more it began to reproduce parts of the world above. Not all of them. There were no fields below, no open road, no weather, no grazing land. But the essentials of community life began to follow people underground. food, water, animals, worship, storage, social contact, security. This creates one of the strangest transformations in the entire story. At first, the underground is valuable because it is unlike the surface, hidden, closed, difficult to enter. Then, to keep people alive for longer, it gradually has to become more like the surface. It needs water, air, places for animals, places for food, places where people can gather. The better the refuge becomes, the more complicated it becomes. And complexity creates maintenance. A ventilation shaft is useful only while it remains clear. A well is useful only while the water remains accessible. A stone door is useful only if people can still move it when necessary. A passage filled with stored objects may become a dangerous obstruction during an emergency. The city therefore required attention even when nobody was hiding from an enemy. This is the point where defensive architecture begins changing social behavior. If people expect the refuge to work someday, they have to care for it today. That means the threat no longer needs to be physically present to affect ordinary life. An empty passage kept clear because it may be needed is evidence of a future danger influencing present behavior. A supply stored underground rather than somewhere more convenient above represents the same thing. A child shown a route before ever needing to escape through it is learning from an event that has not happened to them. This is how communities transmit fear without transmitting panic. They turn it into instruction. The distinction matters. A society cannot remain terrified for generations. It can remain prepared for generations. Preparation is quieter. It looks like maintenance. Storage, memory, a habit of keeping certain spaces available. Knowledge about which entrance leads where. Older people correcting younger ones. People doing small, inconvenient things because there was once a very good reason to do them. Then, when the threat returns, the old behavior suddenly makes sense. There is a tendency to imagine ancient people as either helpless victims of events or heroic defenders confronting them directly. Most survival happens somewhere between those extremes. People adjust. They compromise. They choose the least bad option. They protect what can be protected and accept what cannot. They learn which losses can be recovered from. Derinkuyu belongs to that less dramatic, more persistent history. A family could emerge after danger passed and discover that the house above had been damaged. They might find food missing. An animal that could not be brought below might be gone. Fields might have suffered. The refuge did not promise that life would be waiting exactly as they left it. It promised something more basic. They might still be there to rebuild it. That difference explains the enormous investment more convincingly than any mysterious ancient terror. The people using these underground spaces did not need to believe the end of the world was coming. They needed only to know that, from time to time, armed strangers might. And human beings are perfectly capable of reorganizing large parts of life around a danger that appears only occasionally, provided the consequences of being unprepared are severe enough. After the danger passed, people climbed back into daylight. Animals returned to the surface. Doors opened. Fields demanded attention. The underground chambers became quieter. Normal life resumed because normal life had to resume. Then years might pass. The children who had once been carried through the passages learned to walk them. Later, they showed those routes to children of their own. The original fear did not need to remain vivid. The instructions were enough. By then, hiding had become more than an emergency response. It had become inherited knowledge. And inherited knowledge would determine something the architecture alone could never solve: how an entire community actually behaved once the stone doors closed and the waiting began. Once the stone doors were closed, the cleverness of Derinkuyu mattered less than whether people could tolerate living inside it. This is where the underground city looks very different from the place seen by visitors today. A modern visitor enters with electric lighting, a known route, and the reassuring knowledge that the visit will end whenever the tour does. The ancient experience during an actual period of refuge would have been defined by the opposite condition. People were underground because going outside might be dangerous. That single fact changes the meaning of everything around them. A narrow corridor is no longer merely interesting architecture. It is a route that may be crowded with people carrying supplies. A stone door is no longer an archaeological curiosity. It may be the reason you cannot leave. A ventilation shaft is not simply clever engineering. It is part of what allows everyone around you to continue breathing, and the darkness would have been real. The chambers of Derinkuyu were not illuminated as we see them in photographs. Light had to be produced, most likely with small lamps and flames, and every flame required fuel while also consuming oxygen and producing smoke. That made light something to manage rather than something to take for granted. A lamp could illuminate the person beside you, the rough wall nearby, perhaps the entrance to another passage. Beyond that limited circle, much of the underground space would disappear. For someone familiar with the complex, this was manageable. Routes could be learned, turns could be remembered. The body becomes surprisingly good at navigating spaces it knows well. For someone newly arrived, or for a child waking in an unfamiliar chamber, the experience would have been different. Moving away from the light meant trusting memory, another person, or the feel of the passage itself. There was also no sunrise below to announce that another day had begun. People on the surface measure time almost unconsciously. Light enters a room, the temperature changes, animals become active, shadows move, evening arrives. Deep underground, many of those signals disappear. Time has to be reconstructed from routine. People sleep, wake, eat, fetch water, care for animals, trim lamps, pray, wait for news, then do it again. For a short refuge, this might hardly matter. If people remained below for longer, routine would become increasingly important because routine gives shape to a day that the sky can no longer organize. The city had one enormous advantage here. It could breathe. Derinkuyu's ventilation system is among its most remarkable features, with shafts carrying air through the underground complex. Without such a system, sheltering a substantial population for any significant length of time would have been impossible. The number of people who could actually occupy Derinkuyu at one time is uncertain. The figure of around 20,000 is often repeated as an estimate of maximum capacity, but it should not be mistaken for a documented population count. Even a much smaller number creates the same basic problem. Every person breathes. So does every animal. Lamps and cooking fires consume oxygen. Smoke has to move somewhere. Heat accumulates. An underground refuge can protect people from an enemy and still become dangerous if the air stops moving properly. We cannot know exactly how the inhabitants experienced airflow in each chamber, but they would certainly have noticed its consequences. People living with fire in enclosed spaces understand very quickly when smoke is not clearing as it normally does. A lamp that behaves differently, a room that becomes unusually stuffy, or an area where breathing feels less comfortable would not require scientific instruments to become concerning. The ventilation shafts therefore created a peculiar dependence. The community was hiding from the surface while relying on the surface for air. They wanted separation, but complete separation would kill them. Water presented the same contradiction. Derinkuyu had wells and underground water access, an enormous advantage during refuge. A population relying entirely on water carried from above would quickly face severe limitations. Yet, having water available underground did not mean water simply appeared where everyone needed it. It still had to be collected and moved. Water is heavy. A container large enough to supply several people becomes unpleasant to carry surprisingly quickly, especially through narrow passages or between levels. Then add animals. The stable areas found in Derinkuyu remind us that people were not hiding alone. Livestock represented food, labour, transport, breeding stock, and wealth. Leaving valuable animals on the surface could allow a family to survive a raid while losing much of its ability to recover afterward. So at least some animals were brought inside. This protected them and made nearly every other underground problem more difficult. They needed water. They occupied space. They produced waste. They generated heat and moisture. They made noise. And unlike people, they could not be told why any of this was happening. An animal brought into an unfamiliar, dark enclosure may resist. It may become agitated. Hooves on stone are not quiet. A frightened animal can injure itself or the person handling it. This helps explain the practical logic of keeping stabling areas relatively near the upper levels rather than attempting to move large animals through the deepest parts of the complex. Even there, however, somebody had to care for them. That means that while one part of the community was waiting for news from the surface, another part was doing something much less dramatic: cleaning, feeding, carrying water, checking tethers, moving waste. Survival is full of jobs that continue regardless of how important the historical moment feels. Sanitation may have been one of the least pleasant. We should be cautious because the precise waste management routines of Derinkuyu's inhabitants are not documented in enough detail to reconstruct them confidently. But the physical problem cannot be avoided. Humans produce waste. Animals produce considerably more. In an open settlement, distance and outdoor space help manage the problem. Underground, waste remains inside the same enclosed environment unless somebody moves or contains it. So someone had to deal with it. This is the point where the romantic idea of the secret underground city becomes much more human. A defensive refuge can have brilliant engineering and still require somebody to clean up after a goat. Food brought another set of concerns. Derinkuyu contained extensive storage areas, and storage was central to the entire logic of refuge. Grain and other durable foods could allow people to remain below while danger passed overhead. But food underground had to be protected from moisture, contamination, animals, and simple overconsumption. The longer the stay, the more important quantity became. At the beginning, a household might ask whether it had enough food. After enough time, the question changes. Enough for how long? That is much harder to answer when nobody knows when it will be safe to leave. A known deadline makes rationing relatively straightforward. Uncertainty does not. If you know you will remain underground for 2 days, supplies can be divided accordingly. If the answer might be 2 days, or 5, or longer, every meal contains a decision about the future. We have no surviving ration schedule from Derinkuyu, so there is no reason to invent one. Yet any prolonged refuge involving stored provisions would eventually require restraint. And restraint is harder when distribution is unequal. Some families would naturally arrive with more than others. Some would own more animals. Some would have had more warning. A household with several strong adults could carry more supplies than one consisting of an elderly parent and young children. Community survival encourages sharing. Scarcity can make sharing complicated. Both can be true at the same time. This is one of the dangers of romanticizing refuge communities. People under pressure do not suddenly become perfectly cooperative, nor do they inevitably turn against one another. Most likely, they remain people. They help. They complain. They become tired. They protect relatives. They make compromises. They occasionally resent those compromises. Then they wake up and have to fetch water again. Cooking added another complication, because fire solved several problems while worsening others. It made some foods usable. It provided warmth. It gave light. It also created smoke and consumed oxygen. In an enclosed settlement, those costs mattered. The inhabitants had to live within the limits of their ventilation system, rather than simply lighting fires wherever they pleased. The underground city was therefore a place where ordinary domestic activities became connected to engineering. Cooking affected air. Animals affected air. Lighting affected air. Crowding affected air. A shaft cut through rock centuries earlier could determine whether a room remained comfortable enough to occupy. This interdependence is what made Derinkuyu more than a collection of caves. It was a system, and systems create vulnerabilities. If water becomes contaminated, everyone depending on it has a problem. If a passage is blocked, movement changes. If ventilation becomes poor in one area, people may need to move. If a lamp supply runs low, darkness expands. A surface village has alternatives simply because it has space. An underground refuge concentrates problems. It also concentrates people. Privacy would have been limited during crowded periods of use. Families accustomed to separate houses or household spaces could find themselves living close to neighbours and relatives for an uncertain length of time. Sounds travel. Arguments travel. Illness becomes visible. So does hunger. It is difficult to conceal that your household has food when other people watch you eat. It is difficult to hide that someone is sick when everyone hears them coughing. The same closeness that allows neighbours to help one another also makes withdrawal difficult. There is nowhere very far away to go. That becomes particularly important when we consider illness. People did not stop becoming sick because a raid was taking place. Children developed fevers. Adults suffered stomach problems. People were injured. Older people had chronic difficulties that did not disappear when they descended. Pregnancy continued. Birth could happen. And people could die. The underground city had to accommodate the entire human life cycle, even if only temporarily. An illness that spreads through close contact becomes more difficult to manage in crowded chambers. A person with diarrhea creates a serious sanitation problem where water and waste must already be carefully handled. Someone unable to walk may need assistance through passages designed partly to make movement difficult. Again, the defensive advantages of Derinkuyu could become disadvantages for its own inhabitants. The narrow corridor that slows an attacker also slows someone carrying an injured person. The steep route that makes penetration difficult is difficult for an elderly resident. A heavy barrier that provides security becomes a serious object to move when speed matters. Good defensive architecture does not remove hardship. It chooses which hardship is preferable. For parents, one of the most difficult problems may have been children. Very young children cannot understand strategic silence. A baby cannot be persuaded that crying is inconvenient because armed men may be somewhere above. An older child may understand that something is wrong without understanding what. The adults themselves may not know what is happening. That combination creates a particular kind of uncertainty. A child asks when they are leaving. The adults do not know. A child becomes bored. The adults are listening for news. A child wants to go outside. Outside is exactly where nobody wants the child to go. And still, after enough hours, children play. This is worth remembering. People cannot remain at maximum fear indefinitely. Even during crises, ordinary behavior returns. Someone sleeps. Someone becomes hungry. Someone tells a familiar story. A child finds something to occupy their attention. Someone becomes irritated about a trivial inconvenience. The mind begins making the abnormal normal because it has no other choice. That adaptation is one reason prolonged refuge is possible at all. If every sound remained as frightening on the 5th day as it was during the first hour, exhaustion would become overwhelming. Familiarity gradually reduces the intensity. The underground acquires a rhythm. People learn which sounds belong there. Animals moving, footsteps, a container being placed on stone, voices coming through a passage, a cough from another chamber, water being collected, the movement of a door. The unfamiliar sound is what matters. Something from the entrance, unexpected footsteps, a sudden instruction to be quiet, news arriving from above. Sound may have been one of the few ways the outside world entered the deeper levels. This brings us to a problem no amount of storage could solve. Information. A person hiding deep inside Derinkuyu could have food, water, air, and a secure stone barrier, yet still have no idea what was happening a short distance above. Has the threat arrived? Has it passed? Are people searching the houses? Has another village been attacked? Is the road clear? Can the animals be taken outside? Can work resume? The safest part of the refuge may also be the least informed. Someone had to remain closer to the surface, or eventually approach it to discover what was happening. That creates risk. Complete concealment provides safety, but no knowledge. Observation provides knowledge, but weakens concealment. Someone, at some point, has to find out. And everyone deeper inside depends on the accuracy of whatever information returns. There were no instant communications, no reliable clock counting down until safety, no official announcement that the raid was over. The community had to decide when the outside world had become ordinary again. Leaving too soon could destroy everything the refuge had achieved. Waiting too long consumed resources unnecessarily. So the final stage of hiding may have been one of the most psychologically difficult. Nothing happens. People wait. Another period passes. Still nothing. Silence becomes ambiguous. If attackers are making noise outside, at least you know where the danger is. When there is no sound, you know almost nothing. Eventually, however, someone has to move toward the surface. The journey upward reverses everything that happened during the descent. Air may feel different. Natural light begins to appear. The outside temperature returns. Then, finally, the sky. For someone who had remained underground for an extended period, even ordinary daylight may have required a moment of adjustment. But returning to the surface did not necessarily mean returning to the same life. The house might still be standing or damaged. Food left behind might be gone. An animal that could not be brought underground might have disappeared. A field might have been disturbed. The refuge could save the people without saving everything they owned, and that was still success. Because houses can be repaired, fields can be replanted, animals can sometimes be replaced. A dead or captured family cannot rebuild anything. That is the harsh arithmetic behind Derinkuyu. The underground was not better than the surface. Almost everything about ordinary life was easier above. There was more space, more light, better access to work, open air, fields, roads. Neighbours could leave when they became irritating, at least for a while. People went underground because, during certain moments, comfort stopped being the most important measure. Safety became more important. And once the danger passed, they climbed out. The animals came with them. The lamps were extinguished. The busiest chambers became quiet. Life returned to the fields and houses because that was where it belonged. Yet the refuge remained below. The water system remained. The ventilation shafts remained. The stone doors remained. Food could be stored again. Passages could be cleared. The underground city waited without requiring anyone to live permanently inside it. And every time people emerged alive, the same lesson became harder to forget. The darkness had worked. That memory would prove more durable than any single enemy. The most important moment in the life of an underground refuge may have come after everyone had left it. The danger passed. People returned to their houses and fields. Animals were led back into daylight. The crowded chambers emptied, and the sounds that had filled them gradually disappeared. Then the community had a choice. Forget the experience, or prepare for its return. The fact that underground refuge systems across Cappadocia became so extensive suggests that, over time, enough communities chose the second option. This is where Derinkuyu stops being simply a place people use during emergencies and becomes something more durable, inherited infrastructure. The transformation does not require constant fear. In fact, the long quiet periods between crises may have been just as important as the crises themselves. because that was when the refuge could be repaired, enlarged, stocked, and incorporated into ordinary life. A passage that had been difficult to use could be improved, another chamber could be cut, storage could be reorganized, a defensive point could be strengthened. If too many people had crowded into one area during the previous emergency, more space might be useful the next time. We cannot trace every modification at Derinkuyu to a particular event, and the underground complex developed over a long period. But this kind of incremental adaptation offers a far more plausible model than imagining a single generation constructing the entire place according to one enormous design. People rarely build the final version of a survival system first. They discover what it needs by using it. That principle helps explain why the oldest question surrounding Derinkuyu, who built it, may never have a satisfying one-word answer. Different communities could inherit spaces created by people they never knew. They could enlarge them without knowing precisely why the first chamber had been cut. Later occupants might change the purpose of a room entirely. The builders of one phase did not need to share the language, politics, or religion of those who used another. Stone made continuity possible even when human society changed around it, and Cappadocia changed often. By the Byzantine period, Christian communities were using and developing underground complexes in the region, and the presence of religious spaces inside Derinkuyu gives us an important clue about what refuge eventually meant. People did not merely take their bodies underground, they brought parts of their social world with them. A church or religious chamber below ground is easy to describe as an archaeological feature. Its human importance is more subtle. If refuge lasted beyond a few hours, people needed more than calories and air. They needed routine. A community that normally organized portions of its life around Christian worship did not stop being Christian when it entered a tunnel. Religious observance could continue in altered surroundings, and familiar practices may have helped structure periods when the ordinary markers of time were weakened. Below ground, there is no sunrise visible through a window, no church exterior standing against the sky, no normal movement through the settlement toward worship. Instead, the sacred space exists inside the same rock that contains food stores, sleeping people, passageways, and animals. This proximity can seem strange from a modern perspective, but it reflects something ordinary about historical religion. Sacred life did not float separately above daily inconvenience. People could pray and then fetch water. They could participate in worship and later clean an animal space. A religious chamber could exist near the practical machinery of survival without either becoming less important. There is another contradiction here that is worth noticing. These communities could believe deeply in divine protection while investing enormous effort in physical protection. They prayed. They also built doors. They maintained ventilation. They stored food. They secured water. There was no need to choose between faith and preparation. For the people using Derinkuyu, the two could comfortably occupy the same underground world, and religion offered something architecture could not: meaning. A ventilation shaft could keep people breathing, but it could not explain why frightening things happened. A stone door could delay an attacker, but it could not make uncertainty easier to understand. Religious practice provided continuity with a world larger than the immediate crisis, and continuity matters when normal life has been interrupted. So did family, so did memory. The older a refuge system became, the more likely it was that people entered spaces already known to their parents and grandparents. This changes the emotional quality of hiding. The first generation to use a newly cut chamber may see an emergency solution. A later generation sees a place with a history. Someone remembers being taken there as a child. Someone knows that an older relative survived a raid there. Someone recognizes a particular chamber because the family stored food in it for years. The physical space begins accumulating stories even when those stories leave no archaeological trace. This is how preparedness becomes culture without requiring formal laws. A child can learn an emergency route long before understanding the political circumstances that made it necessary. There is no need for a lecture on Byzantine frontier strategy. You learn because adults show you. This passage goes here. That room contains supplies. Do not obstruct this entrance. Stay near the family if everyone begins moving. The lesson is physical. Later, when the child becomes an adult, the instructions can be passed on again. Eventually, nobody needs to remember the original emergency. The procedure survives by being useful. That is one of the most durable forms of human knowledge. We often imagine tradition as something ceremonial, clothing, festivals, prayers, songs, recipes. But communities also inherit practical traditions. Where to build, where not to build, how to store food, which road becomes dangerous after heavy rain, where animals should be moved in winter, what to do when strangers approach. The underground refuge belonged to this world of accumulated local knowledge. And local knowledge can be remarkably conservative when the cost of being wrong is high. Suppose several peaceful decades pass. The old refuge may begin to feel excessive. Maintaining a passage is work. Keeping access clear is inconvenient. Stored material could be placed somewhere easier. Younger people may never have experienced the danger that older people remember. This is a recurring problem in every system designed for rare emergencies. Preparation looks wasteful when nothing happens, until something happens. Then the neglected doorway matters. The missing supplies matter. The blocked passage matters. The old person who insisted that everyone remember the route suddenly seems less old-fashioned. We cannot document conversations like these at Derinkuyu, and there is no need to invent them. The architecture itself demonstrates that enough effort was repeatedly invested to keep subterranean refuge viable across long periods. That maintenance required social cooperation. No large refuge functions as thousands of completely independent households. Ventilation benefits everyone. Water sources are shared. Passages are shared. Defensive barriers protect groups of people. Movement through narrow routes affects whoever comes behind. The architecture forces a degree of communal behavior. That does not mean everyone was equal. Families almost certainly differed in wealth, status, resources, and influence, just as they did above ground. Some households would possess more animals or food. Some individuals would have greater authority. Religious and community leadership did not disappear when people descended. Yet the underground imposed forms of dependence that could soften some distinctions and sharpen others. A wealthy person still needs air. A powerful person still needs water. A household with abundant food may depend on someone else who knows how a defensive feature works. A strong adult may help an elderly neighbor through a difficult passage. Knowledge, labor, and physical ability acquire immediate value. This can encourage cooperation without turning the refuge into a harmonious community. People under pressure remain complicated. Shared danger may make neighbors generous. Scarcity may make the same neighbors suspicious. One family may share supplies and quietly remember the debt later. Someone may feel another household brought too little. Someone else may believe they have already contributed more than their fair share. There is no evidence that Derinkuyu became a place of constant internal conflict, and there is equally little reason to imagine perfect solidarity. Human communities rarely choose either extreme. They negotiate. That may be one of the reasons routine was so important. Rules, whether formal or simply customary, reduce the number of decisions people must argue about during an emergency. Animals go here. Food is kept there. This route stays open. Certain areas are protected. Someone checks the entrance. Someone manages a task because they have done it before. The more often a refuge is used, the more these arrangements can become automatic. And automatic behavior saves time. It also preserves knowledge after the people who created the system are gone. By this point, the question of what frightened the builders begins to look slightly different. Fear alone cannot produce Derinkuyu. Fear can make people run into a cave. To create and maintain something this complex requires another quality: confidence. Not confidence that nothing bad will happen, confidence that preparation works. People had to believe that if they invested labour underground, there was a reasonable chance the refuge would save them later. Every successful use reinforced that belief. A family descends. The threat passes. They emerge alive. Whatever discomfort they experienced below becomes easier to justify afterward. The passage was too narrow. The air was unpleasant in one room. The children were miserable. Nobody slept well. An animal caused trouble. And yet everyone came out. That is persuasive. The next time someone suggests enlarging a chamber or storing additional food, the argument has history behind it. The underground city, therefore, grew not only because people were frightened, but because the system repeatedly demonstrated its value. This is an important correction to the title question. What terrified ancient humans enough to build this? Is a wonderful way into Derinkuyu, because the architecture looks like the physical expression of enormous fear. But terror is probably too simple. People do extraordinary things for dangers they have learned to manage calmly. A sailor maintains lifeboats without spending every voyage terrified of drowning. A city builds flood defences during years when the river behaves perfectly well. A farming community stores grain without assuming famine will begin tomorrow. Preparation can become almost boring. That may have happened here. The more established the underground system became, the less dramatic maintaining it needed to feel. Someone storing food below might be doing nothing more exciting than putting food where food had always been kept. Someone clearing a passage might think of it as work rather than defence. A child walking through the upper chambers might not find them mysterious at all. The remarkable place we now call an underground city could, in parts of its long history, have been familiar infrastructure. That familiarity helps explain its endurance. And endurance mattered because the political world above did not remain the same. The centuries of Byzantine-Arab conflict were important in the development of Cappadocia's defensive landscape, but history did not politely stop once that particular period ended. Political control shifted. New powers appeared. Old threats disappeared. Different ones replaced them. The people living in Cappadocia did not need to rebuild their defensive logic from the beginning every time the name of an enemy changed. The underground did not care who was approaching. This is one of the reasons ancient infrastructure can outlive the circumstances that created it. A wall built against one army may resist another. A road built by one empire may be used by its conquerors. A granary created for one community may feed the next, and a refuge dug because of one period of insecurity can shelter people during a completely different one. The architecture is politically indifferent. It simply remains useful. This is where the story of Derinkuyu begins to stretch beyond its most famous medieval context. Later invasions and periods of instability would pass through Anatolia. The Seljuk world, Mongol expansion, the rise of Ottoman power, and local conflicts changed the political landscape repeatedly. We should be cautious here. It is easy to take every invasion that ever touched Anatolia and claim that Derinkuyu was specifically built for it. That is not supported by the evidence. The Mongols, for example, belong to a later chapter in Anatolian history. They may form part of the long history of insecurity during which underground refuges remained useful, but they should not be presented as the original reason Derinkuyu existed. That distinction actually makes the site more interesting. A shelter does not need to know which enemy it was built for. If it works, later people can use it, and Cappadocia's underground tradition did survive. For centuries, people continued to know that the ground beneath their settlements could offer protection. The details of use changed. Communities changed. Religious and political identities changed. Some spaces were abandoned. Others remained connected to daily life. But the basic idea endured with remarkable persistence. When danger comes, the surface is optional. This idea survived far longer than we might expect. Long enough, in fact, to carry us toward a period when the people seeking safety underground were no longer inhabitants of some distant medieval world. They were living in the age of railways, telegraphs, photography, and modern newspapers. And they still knew what their ancestors had known. When frightening news arrived, there were nights when sleeping beneath the earth felt safer than sleeping beneath your own roof. By the time the great period of Byzantine Arab frontier warfare had faded into history, Cappadocia had already learned a lesson that did not depend on the identity of any particular enemy. If the surface became dangerous, the ground could still be useful. That sounds obvious after spending so much time inside Derinkuyu, but it has an important consequence. An underground refuge does not become obsolete merely because the people who originally threatened its inhabitants have disappeared. If the passages still exist, if the entrances are still known, and if the community still remembers how to use them, the same architecture can survive one political age and enter another. And Anatolia provided no shortage of political ages. By the late 11th century, Byzantine control across much of central Anatolia was being transformed by the arrival and expansion of Turkish powers, particularly following the Byzantine defeat at Manzikert in 1071. The political map did not change everywhere at once, nor did every village experience these transformations in the same way, but Cappadocia increasingly belonged to a different world from the one in which the earlier Byzantine frontier defences had developed. For the underground refuges, however, political labels mattered less than practical circumstances. A passage remained narrow, a well remained useful, a hidden entrance remained difficult for a stranger to find. A stone barrier still worked from the inside. The people using those features could change, while the basic defensive logic remained intact. This is one reason we should be suspicious of any explanation that tries to attach Derinkuyu to a single historical enemy. The site is too old, too altered, and too repeatedly reused for that. Its history resembles a tool handed down through generations. The first person who made the tool may have needed it for one purpose. Later people discover that it solves their problem too. In the 13th century, another great disruption reached Anatolia. The Mongol expansion had already transformed enormous areas of Eurasia when Mongol forces moved into the region. In 1243, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum suffered a major defeat at the Battle of Köse-Dağ, after which Mongol influence over Anatolia became increasingly important. It is tempting to place Derinkuyu directly into this dramatic moment and say that its inhabitants fled below as Mongol armies approached. Popular history often does exactly that. The reality is less tidy. Cappadocia's underground refuges already existed. Their defensive use had developed long before the Mongols arrived, and we do not possess a detailed account describing one particular Mongol assault on Derinkuyu and exactly what happened inside. Still, the broader point remains. The 13th century brought another period in which insecurity made an old defensive landscape potentially valuable. The people of Cappadocia did not need to invent underground refuge in response to the Mongols. They inherited it. That is a much more interesting relationship between architecture and history. A threat can disappear while the behavior it created remains available. Centuries later, another threat activates it. The people hiding may no longer know the names of those who first cut the oldest chambers. They may speak differently, worship differently, live under a different ruler. Yet when they move through the same narrow passage, their bodies encounter exactly the same solution. Duck here, turn here, go deeper, close this, wait. The continuity belongs to the place rather than to a single empire. Over the following centuries, Cappadocia was gradually incorporated into the Ottoman world. By the 15th century, Ottoman authority had become established across the region, beginning another long phase in the history of its communities. This did not mean that everyone suddenly abandoned the underground. Some rock-cut spaces continued to have ordinary practical uses. Storage remained useful. Cellars remained useful. Sheltered spaces remained useful. Christian communities continued living in Cappadocia under Ottoman rule, alongside Muslim populations, within a landscape where caves, rock-cut churches, houses, and subterranean spaces were already part of the built environment. That is an important distinction because the word abandoned can mislead us. A vast underground complex does not have to be functioning at maximum defensive capacity to remain part of local life. One room may still be used while another is forgotten. An entrance may remain known to one family, while a deeper passage becomes blocked. A chamber once used for refuge may become storage. A section that once mattered greatly may slowly disappear from living memory. Derinkuyu could therefore fade gradually rather than being switched off. This is how old places often survive, not as intact museums, as fragments of usefulness. The people living above them may know one portion intimately and have no idea what lies beyond a blocked wall. And this gradual fading helps us understand something that will become very important later when the underground city is supposedly rediscovered. For now, though, the tradition of refuge had not entirely disappeared. There is a remarkable piece of evidence from the beginning of the 20th century that brings the human logic of Cappadocia's underground spaces startlingly close to the modern world. In 1909, violence associated with the Adana massacres spread fear among Christian communities in parts of the Ottoman Empire. Cappadocian Greeks in the region around what is now Derinkuyu, then known by its Greek name Malakopia, were still aware of underground spaces beneath their settlement. Contemporary testimony recorded that during the period of fear, people used subterranean refuges. This is an extraordinary moment in the history of the site, not because the underground suddenly returned after being forgotten for 1,000 years, but because it shows just how long the old logic could survive. Think about the date. This is no longer the world we instinctively associate with underground cities. Photography existed. Telegraph networks connected distant places. Railways crossed large territories. Newspapers carried international news. Automobiles existed. The Ottoman Empire had ministries, bureaucracies, modern military institutions, and political movements arguing over the future of the state. And in Cappadocia, when people became frightened enough, an ancient solution was still available: go underground. The contrast is almost absurdly powerful. Human technology had changed enormously. The basic problem had not. A person afraid of organized violence still wanted a place where armed people could not easily reach their family. The same volcanic rock that had offered protection centuries earlier remained beneath their feet. There is something revealing in that persistence. Modernity does not arrive everywhere in a single wave and erase older behavior. People use whatever works. A community can read a newspaper and still rely on a refuge whose earliest excavation may predate the language in which that newspaper is printed. A person can live in the 20th century and make a survival decision that would have been immediately understandable to someone in the 10th. The tools of daily life change faster than certain human problems. And the 1909 episode also prevents us from treating Derinkuyu as a purely archaeological abstraction. The fear associated with underground refuge was not confined to some distant, unknowable, ancient population. People within the lifetime of grandparents and great-grandparents of the modern era still understood why going below could feel sensible. They did not need theories about lost civilizations. They did not need a forgotten catastrophe. They needed uncertainty about what other human beings might do. That has been the uncomfortable answer following us through the entire story. The threat was not necessarily mysterious. It was often human. This is less satisfying than imagining some unknown disaster so terrible that an entire population fled from the sky. But it fits the evidence far better, and it explains why the refuge could remain useful across such different centuries. Earthquakes do not negotiate with stone doors. A volcanic eruption is not slowed by a narrow defensive corridor. A changing climate does not care whether an entrance is hidden. Those features make particular sense against people. People search. People pursue. People become frustrated by obstacles. People may decide that reaching a hidden population is not worth the time. The design of Derinkuyu repeatedly reflects that relationship. Hide the entrance. Restrict movement. Seal passages from within. Protect water. Buy time. Wait for the danger to leave. Once we see that pattern, the need for a single terrifying event begins to disappear. The title question asks, what frightened ancient humans enough to build this? The answer increasingly looks less like one enormous fear and more like the accumulation of many smaller, historically ordinary fears. A raid, an army moving through the region, political disorder, religious violence, the possibility of capture, the possibility of losing children, the possibility of losing the animals and food on which the following year depended. None of these is mysterious. Together, repeated across centuries, they are powerful enough to reshape a landscape. And because the underground system remained available, each new period of insecurity could reinforce an old habit. This is how temporary solutions become extraordinarily permanent. Someone cuts a storage chamber because it is useful. Another person enlarges it because hiding there worked. A later community connects passages. Someone adds or improves defensive barriers. Ventilation allows more people to remain below. Water access makes longer stays possible. Religious spaces appear within a community that uses the refuge. Generations pass. The political reason for one modification is forgotten. The modification remains. Eventually, the system becomes older than the explanation for it. That may be one reason Derinkuyu attracts so much speculation today. We naturally assume that something so elaborate must have been created for an equally elaborate reason. A vast underground city seems to demand a vast secret. But history does not always work that way. Complex things can emerge from repeated, simple decisions. A path through a field becomes a road because enough people walk it. A temporary market becomes a town because enough people return. A defensive ditch becomes a wall, then another wall, then a fortress, because every generation inherits the previous problem along with the previous solution. Derinkuyu may be the underground version of the same process. Nobody needs to wake one morning and announce that they are building a city 80 meters beneath the earth. They need only decide that one more chamber would be useful. One more connection would make retreat easier. One more barrier would make the refuge safer. One deeper space would give people somewhere to go if the upper section were discovered. Accumulated over long enough periods, practical decisions become monumental. And then history performs another trick. The danger eventually does stop. Not permanently, of course. No society reaches a point where violence becomes impossible, but the particular social conditions that make an underground refuge part of ordinary emergency planning can disappear. For the Christian communities of Cappadocia, that final transformation came in the early 20th century. The Ottoman Empire collapsed after the First World War. Years of warfare and nationalist conflict followed across Anatolia and the former Ottoman territories. Relations between Greek Orthodox and Muslim communities became entangled in the much larger conflict between Greece and the emerging Turkish national movement. The consequences were enormous. In 1923, Greece and Turkey agreed to a compulsory population exchange based largely on religious identity. Roughly 1.2 million Orthodox Christians from Turkey were sent to Greece, while hundreds of thousands of Muslims from Greece were transferred to Turkey. Cappadocia's Greek Orthodox communities were included. Families whose ancestors had lived in central Anatolia for generations had to leave. This was not simply a political change above Derinkuyu. It was a rupture in memory. The people leaving carried knowledge that archaeology cannot easily recover. Local names, family histories, which spaces had been used, which entrances were known, stories about previous periods of refuge. Routes that made sense only to someone raised near them. A physical structure can survive population change remarkably well. Living knowledge cannot. Once the communities that had used underground spaces departed, the relationship between the settlement and the world beneath it changed. New residents could inhabit the houses. Fields could still be cultivated. Streets remained. The landscape remained Cappadocia. But knowledge was no longer continuous in quite the same way. Some underground rooms remained known, others were closed. Entrances disappeared behind construction or debris. Passages became inaccessible. A chamber that had once connected to a much larger system could appear to be nothing more than a cellar. This is how a city can be forgotten while people continue living directly above it. Not because everyone somehow loses knowledge of underground rooms overnight, because knowledge shrinks. One generation knows a network, another knows a chamber, another knows that there is probably something behind the wall. Eventually, the wall is simply a wall. And this brings us to the famous modern story of Derinkuyu. It is usually told almost perfectly. In 1963, a man living in the town was renovating his house. According to the familiar version, he noticed that his chickens kept disappearing through a small opening. Curious, he investigated. He knocked through a wall in his basement. Behind it, he found a room, then another passage. And beyond that, an underground city forgotten for centuries. It is a wonderful story, possibly a little too wonderful. The broad fact that the underground complex came to modern attention during renovation of a house in the early 1960s is widely repeated. The more elaborate details, especially the disappearing chickens, are much harder to trace to reliable contemporary documentation and may belong to the later folklore surrounding the discovery. This is exactly the kind of detail that grows around mysterious places because it is irresistible. A man, a wall, missing chickens, one blow with a tool, a lost city. History rarely provides such perfect openings, so when it does, we should at least check whether history actually provided them. The more defensible version is quieter. A resident altered part of his house. Behind a wall, an opening led into subterranean spaces. Further investigation revealed that those spaces belonged to something far larger than an ordinary basement. And suddenly, people standing in a 20th century Turkish town were confronted with the scale of the world beneath them. Exploration followed. Passages were cleared. Rooms were identified. The depth and complexity of the site became increasingly apparent. In 1965, Derinkuyu was open to visitors. The refuge had changed function once again. Storage had become shelter. Shelter had become inherited infrastructure. Infrastructure had faded into forgotten space. And forgotten space had become archaeology. Soon it would become something else as well. A mystery, because once the people who understood an old structure are gone, modern observers begin supplying explanations of their own. Some would be reasonable, some would be speculative, and some would transform Derinkuyu into evidence for lost civilizations, ancient catastrophes, secret technologies, or disasters for which the underground city itself offers very little support. The strange thing is that the real history hardly needs any of that. By the time modern visitors began descending its passages, Derinkuyu already contained a far more interesting story. It had survived longer than the political worlds that repeatedly gave people reasons to use it. The enemies changed, the languages changed, empires disappeared, communities departed, and eventually even the memory of how much lay beneath the houses became fragmented. The tunnels were still there. What had disappeared was the explanation. Once Derinkuyu began attracting modern attention, an unusual reversal took place. For centuries, the value of the underground spaces had depended on how little outsiders knew about them. Now, their value depended on discovery. Passages that had once been useful because they were concealed were cleared so that people could enter them. Chambers designed to disappear beneath an inhabited landscape became archaeological attractions. Electric lights were installed in spaces whose original users had depended on small flames. Stairways and routes were made navigable for visitors who arrived knowing, with complete confidence, that they would be back above ground before lunch. And as Derinkuyu became easier to visit, its story became harder to control. The physical site was extraordinary enough. Yet almost immediately, numbers began attaching themselves to it. 18 levels, 20,000 inhabitants, hundreds of entrances, miles of tunnels, connections to other underground cities, an ancient population driven permanently beneath the earth by some forgotten catastrophe. These claims are repeated so frequently that they can begin to sound like measurements rather than interpretations. Some contain a real historical or archaeological basis. Others require considerably more caution. And the difference matters because Derinkuyu becomes more interesting, not less, when we stop demanding that every impressive claim be true. Start with the depth. The underground complex reaches roughly 85 meters below the surface at its deepest known extent. That is real enough to make the descent remarkable without embellishment. But the popular description of 18 underground floors creates a mental image of something far more orderly than the site itself. A modern building has floors because it is designed around repeated horizontal levels. Derinkuyu grew through excavated chambers, passages, shafts, stairways, and spaces created at different times for different purposes. Some popular accounts count as many as 18 levels or strata, while only a smaller number of major levels are accessible to visitors. So when we hear 18 stories underground, it is better not to picture an ancient apartment tower turned upside down. There were no neat elevator stops. The city developed inside geology, not according to a modern floor plan. That irregularity is actually evidence of the long process we have been following. A place built all at once tends to reveal a unified plan. A place enlarged repeatedly tends to reveal compromises. A passage meets an older chamber. A shaft serves several areas. A room exists because the rock permitted it there. Another section follows an existing route. Different periods leave different needs inside the same structure. The apparent disorder is part of the history. Then there is the famous population figure. Derinkuyu is frequently said to have accommodated 20,000 people, sometimes with livestock and supplies. It is an astonishing number, and it has become one of the defining facts in popular descriptions of the site. The difficulty is that we do not possess an ancient census recording 20,000 people entering Derinkuyu and closing the door behind them. The number is an estimate of potential capacity. That distinction is important. Capacity describes what a space might accommodate under particular assumptions. Population describes who was actually there. A modern stadium may hold 50,000 people. That does not mean 50,000 people live inside it. Derinkuyu could undoubtedly shelter a substantial population. The scale of its ventilation, storage, water access, stabling, and internal organization supports that conclusion. But whether its maximum estimated capacity was ever reached, and under what circumstances, is much harder to establish. In fact, The practical problems we encountered earlier become more severe as the number rises. 20,000 people do not merely require enough floor space to stand or sleep. They require water, air, food, movement, waste management. They bring illness, children, elderly relatives, possessions, and animals. Every additional person adds pressure to systems that cannot simply expand during the emergency. So the famous figure is best treated as an illustration of enormous potential scale rather than a known historical headcount. It is still impressive. A refuge does not need 20,000 confirmed residents to represent a remarkable achievement. The desire to maximize the number tells us something about the way modern audiences respond to ancient places. We like superlatives: deepest, largest, oldest, most mysterious. 20,000 sounds better in a headline than an uncertain but potentially very large number of people. Archaeology is frequently less cooperative than headlines. The next famous claim is even more evocative. Derinkuyu was supposedly connected through long tunnels to other underground cities, particularly Cappadocia, another extensive subterranean complex in Cappadocia. Cappadocia lies only several kilometers away, and the existence of multiple large underground settlements in the region naturally encourages the idea of a hidden subterranean network running beneath the landscape. One often repeated claim describes a tunnel several kilometers long connecting the two. There are passages and tunnel systems associated with Cappadocia's underground settlements, and the possibility of connections has long attracted attention. But the specific claim of a fully established, traversable tunnel directly linking Derinkuyu and Cappadocia should be treated cautiously unless supported by secure archaeological confirmation. The difference between "there may have been underground connections" and "you could walk underground from one city to the other" is substantial. The second version is simply more satisfying. It turns separate refuges into a hidden civilization, and once that image appears, imagination has very little difficulty expanding it. If two cities were connected, perhaps dozens were. If dozens were connected, perhaps an entire population lived below ground. If an entire population lived below ground, something enormous must have driven them there. And now, the original archaeological problem has quietly transformed into another kind of story. The catastrophe story. It comes in many versions. Ancient climate disaster, a devastating war, a cosmic impact, volcanic destruction, a lost civilization fleeing an unknown enemy. Sometimes even supernatural or extraterrestrial explanations enter the discussion. The architecture feels too strange to have an ordinary explanation, so the explanation becomes as strange as the architecture. There is a psychological appeal to this. Derinkuyu does not look like our idea of ordinary life. Most of us would not voluntarily choose to spend days beneath the ground with livestock, limited light, and thousands of neighbors. Therefore, we assume that the people who created it must have faced something almost unimaginable. But this reasoning contains a hidden mistake. We are comparing their emergency architecture with our normal life. The relevant comparison is their emergency architecture with their emergency. A narrow underground chamber is unpleasant compared with a bedroom. It may be extremely attractive compared with capture by raiders. A heavy stone door feels claustrophobic when nobody is pursuing you. It feels different if someone is. The architecture does not need an apocalyptic explanation. It needs circumstances in which inconvenience is preferable to exposure. History provides plenty of those. This is not to say that every question about Derinkuyu has been solved. Far from it. The earliest phases remain difficult to date. We cannot identify with certainty the first people who began excavating the spaces that eventually became the larger complex. Various groups have been proposed. The Hittites appear frequently in popular accounts because their civilization dominated much of Anatolia during the 2nd millennium BCE, and because they constructed defensive works elsewhere. The Phrygians are another candidate often associated with early excavation, particularly because of their known presence in central Anatolia and their experience with rock-cut architecture. Other arguments place greater emphasis on later populations. What can be said with much more confidence is that Byzantine Christian communities made extensive use of Cappadocia's subterranean and rock-cut environments, and that underground refuges were particularly valuable during periods of medieval insecurity. This leaves us with an archaeological structure that has a clearer middle history than beginning, and that is uncomfortable. People prefer origin stories. We want the first day, the first builder, the first reason. We want someone to stand on the surface, look at the ground, and decide to create Derinkuyu. The evidence does not give us that moment. It may never have existed. The first excavation may have been so modest that nobody involved would recognize the enormous underground city that later grew from it. A storage room is not a city. A cellar is not a fortress. A short hiding place is not an 18-level complex. The transformation occurs in between, through additions that individually may have seemed perfectly practical. That makes identifying the builder almost impossible. Who built an old city above ground? The person who founded the first settlement? The ruler who built its walls? The generations who added houses? The engineers who created its water system? The people who rebuilt after a fire? The answer is usually all of them at different moments. Derinkuyu deserves the same patience. Its construction history may be collective, intermittent, and far longer than the lifespan of any one society. Modern archaeology also changed the scale of the mystery in another way. Derinkuyu is not alone. Cappadocia contains numerous underground settlements and complexes, some small and others remarkably extensive. Cappadocia is among the best known, but archaeological investigation across the region has revealed many examples of subterranean construction, and discoveries continue to remind us how incomplete our map of underground Cappadocia may be. In 2014, during development work near Nevşehir, another enormous underground complex came to light. Initial reports suggested a site of exceptional size, potentially larger in overall extent than Derinkuyu. This discovery was important for a simple reason. It made Derinkuyu less unique. That might sound as though it makes Derinkuyu less impressive. It does the opposite. One underground city can be an anomaly. A landscape containing many underground complexes represents a tradition. Now the question is no longer why one peculiar community did something extraordinary. We have to ask why subterranean architecture became so deeply embedded in the way communities across this region used their environment. Geology explains part of it. The volcanic rock made excavation practical. Storage explains part. Climate control below ground made certain spaces useful even without danger. Defense explains a great deal. Repeated periods of insecurity made hidden refuge valuable. Religion and settlement patterns added further uses. And because every generation could inherit spaces already excavated, the cost of continuing the tradition was lower than the cost of inventing it. The result is not one mystery with one answer. It is a system that became useful for several reasons at once. That is usually how durable human practices survive. A feature created for one purpose gains another, then another. Eventually nobody can reduce it to a single function. A cellar becomes storage and shelter. A shelter becomes a place of worship during danger. A defensive passage becomes part of local memory. A refuge becomes a tourist attraction. The same rock keeps changing meaning because the people around it change. Modern tourism has added its own layer. Today, visitors descend into Derinkuyu voluntarily. They take photographs. They follow signs. They wait for other visitors to squeeze through narrow passages. They examine stone doors that nobody intends to close behind them. For someone uncomfortable in confined spaces, even the modern visit can be challenging. Some passages require bending, and the knowledge of how much rock lies overhead is difficult to ignore. Yet the experience is controlled. There is an exit. There are lights. Other people know where you are. The route has been prepared. The original defensive meaning is almost impossible to reproduce because one essential ingredient is missing: uncertainty. A visitor knows the surface is safe. The people who used Derinkuyu as refuge did not. This may be the single greatest difference between seeing the site and understanding it. The architecture is visible. The uncertainty is gone. And without uncertainty, many features can appear excessive. Why so deep? Why so many barriers? Why bring animals inside? Why create a refuge large enough for so many people? Because we see the completed structure, but not the decisions that sent people into it. Archaeology preserves the answer made of stone. It does not preserve the rumour arriving from another village. It does not preserve the warning that may or may not be true. It does not preserve a parent deciding whether it is time to leave the house. It does not preserve the argument over which possessions can be carried. It does not preserve the moment someone decides that waiting another hour is too dangerous. Those things vanish. The tunnel remains. This imbalance is one reason ancient structures can seem more mysterious than the people who built them probably found them. We see the solution after the problem has disappeared. Then we try to reconstruct a problem large enough to deserve the solution. Sometimes we make it too large. There need not have been one terror great enough to produce 85 meters of underground city. There needed to be enough occasions when another meter seemed worthwhile. Enough raids. Enough instability. Enough successful retreats. Enough generations willing to maintain what previous generations had learned. The paradox begins to dissolve when we replace one enormous moment of fear with accumulated experience. And yet, one part of the paradox remains. People continued expanding and maintaining a refuge that was uncomfortable, inconvenient, difficult to navigate, and dependent on systems that could themselves fail. They accepted darkness to avoid exposure, confinement to avoid capture, uncertainty below because uncertainty above was worse. That choice is the real mystery worth carrying into the final part of the story. Not who frightened them once, but how danger becomes familiar enough that an extraordinary response begins to feel ordinary. Because by now we have descended far enough to see that Derinkuyu was never really a monument to panic. It was a monument to something quieter. People learning what worked, remembering it, and refusing to forget it too soon. After descending through all those levels, passing the narrow corridors, the ventilation shafts, the wells, the stables, the storage chambers, and the great circular stone doors, we can finally return to the question that brought us here. What could frighten people enough to build Derinkuyu? At the beginning, the question seemed to demand an extraordinary answer. A structure this strange appears to require an equally strange cause. 85 meters beneath the ground, large enough to shelter a substantial population equipped with water, ventilation, food storage, places for animals, religious spaces, and defensive barriers. Surely something terrible must have happened. Perhaps one enormous invasion, one forgotten catastrophe. One moment when an entire population looked at the world above and decided it was no longer safe to live there. But after spending time inside the history of Derinkuyu, that explanation begins to feel less necessary. There probably was no single moment when people decided to build the underground city we see today. There may not have been a single people who built it. And there was probably no single fear powerful enough to explain every chamber, every passage and every generation that used them. Derinkuyu makes more sense when we stop looking for one terrible event and begin looking at repetition. The geology came first. Cappadocia offered people a landscape in which cutting into the earth was unusually practical. Volcanic tuff could be excavated into useful spaces, and long before the underground complexes reached their later scale, people in the wider region understood the advantages of subterranean rooms. Cool storage was useful. Shelter was useful. Space for animals was useful. A chamber inside the rock did not need an enemy to justify its existence. Then history changed the value of that chamber. At some point, being underground was not merely convenient, it was safer than being visible. That may have been the decisive transformation. Once people discovered that an excavated space could protect them during insecurity, every successful refuge taught the same lesson. A deeper chamber might be safer. A narrower passage might be easier to defend. A concealed entrance might delay discovery. A stone barrier might stop someone who found the entrance anyway. A ventilation shaft might allow more people to remain below. A reliable source of water might allow them to remain there longer. Food storage could extend that time further. Stables could preserve animals that families would need after they emerged. None of these changes requires panic on the day it was made. In fact, most of the work was probably done when nobody was running from anyone. That may be the most revealing detail of all. Fear explains why people use a refuge. Memory explains why they improve it afterward. Someone survives. The community returns to the surface. The immediate danger disappears. Then people look at what worked and what did not. A passage was too crowded. More storage would have helped. An entrance needed strengthening. Another connection might make movement easier. The lesson is preserved in stone. By the time another threat arrives, part of the thinking has already been done. This is how Derinkuyu could grow without a master plan. Generation after generation inherited both the architecture and the knowledge contained within it. And the knowledge was simple. The surface is where life happens. The underground is where life can be preserved when the surface becomes dangerous. Those are very different things. The inhabitants of Cappadocia were not trying to escape the world permanently. Everything important to ordinary agricultural life pulled them upward. Fields needed sunlight. Animals needed pasture. Roads connected settlements. Trade required movement. Houses were above. Weather mattered. Seasons mattered. The underground could provide security, but it could never replace the landscape on which the community depended. So people returned whenever they could. That alone should make us cautious about the image of a lost subterranean civilization living permanently beneath Cappadocia. Derinkuyu was extraordinary precisely because it supported the ordinary world above. It was the place you hoped not to need. And that changes the emotional meaning of the entire city. A storage chamber is no longer simply a room cut in rock. It is food that might still exist after a raid. A stable is not simply evidence that animals were kept underground. It is a family's wealth and future being protected alongside them. A well is not simply an engineering feature. It is the difference between hiding briefly and being able to wait. A ventilation shaft is not merely an impressive ancient achievement. It is what allows the stone around you to remain a refuge rather than become a trap. And the rolling stone doors may be the clearest expression of the logic behind everything. They are often the first images people remember from Derinkuyu. Large circular stones positioned so that passages could be blocked from inside. They look primitive and ingenious at the same time. Their purpose is immediately understandable. Someone may be coming through here. Stop them. But a door like that also contains the entire paradox of the underground city. To become safer, you close yourself in. The barrier protecting you from the person outside also limits your own movement. Once it is in place, you have made a decision about which side of the stone is more dangerous. That decision is Derinkuyu. Everything else follows from it. Air matters because the door is closed. Water matters because the door is closed. Food matters because the door is closed. Patience matters because the door is closed. The people inside are wagering that the conditions they have created below will remain tolerable longer than the danger above will remain present. It is not a perfect solution. It is a calculation. And human beings have always survived by making calculations like this, not between safety and danger, because history rarely offers such a clean choice. Between one danger and another, between losing property and losing people, between discomfort and capture, between leaving too early and waiting too long, between the familiar difficulty inside and the unknown situation outside. Seen this way, Derinkuyu stops looking like evidence that ancient people were terrified beyond reason. It begins to look like evidence that they were remarkably practical. The underground city was not built by people who had surrendered to fear. It was used by people who had found a way to manage fear. That distinction matters. Panic does not maintain ventilation systems across generations. Panic does not carefully organize water access. Panic does not preserve defensive knowledge over centuries. Those things require patience, labor, cooperation, and the willingness to prepare during periods when preparation may feel unnecessary. This is why the repeated conflicts of medieval Cappadocia matter more than any single dramatic invasion. The Byzantine Arab frontier created long periods in which raids and insecurity could make underground refuge valuable. Later, political upheavals gave old spaces new relevance. The Mongols did not need to be the original reason for Derinkuyu in order for an inherited refuge to remain useful in an age of Mongol expansion. The Ottoman period did not erase the underground landscape, and remarkably, the logic remained understandable into the 20th century. That detail from 1909 is worth returning to because it collapses the distance between us and the people who used these spaces. By then, the world had telegraphs and photographs. Cities had electric lights. Motorcars were beginning to appear on roads. Modern states were arguing about constitutions, nationalism, citizenship, and political reform. Yet when violence created fear among Christian communities in Cappadocia, people could still turn towards subterranean refuge. The response survived because the human problem survived. Someone might hurt us. Where can we go? No lost civilization is required. No unknown technology. No ancient apocalypse. Just a question that parents have asked in almost every violent period of human history. Where will the family be safest? And that may also explain why Derinkuyu continued to accumulate meaning long after its original builders disappeared. The oldest excavators may have known nothing of Byzantines. Byzantine Christians who expanded or used the complex could not have imagined Mongol expansion centuries later. Medieval inhabitants could not have imagined the final decades of the Ottoman Empire. The Greek Orthodox communities, who still knew the underground spaces in the early 20th century, could not have known that the population exchange of 1923 would soon break their long connection with Cappadocia. Each generation lived inside its own present. The underground passed through all of them. Then the continuity broke. Communities left, knowledge fragmented, entrances closed. Some spaces remained known, while others disappeared behind walls and debris. The refuge that had survived, because people remembered how to use it, gradually became mysterious because people no longer did. And that is an interesting reversal. For most of its useful history, Derinkuyu needed memory. For its modern fame, it needed forgetting. If everyone had continuously understood every chamber and passage, there would have been no dramatic rediscovery. No lost city beneath a house. No stories of a homeowner breaking through a wall into another world. The underground would simply have remained local infrastructure. Instead, the disappearance of living knowledge created the conditions for mystery. Modern people entered the passages and encountered the final result without possessing the generations of experience that had produced it. We saw enormous depth and asked what catastrophe demanded it. We saw defensive doors and imagined an unknown enemy. We saw ventilation shafts and wondered whether thousands of people lived permanently in darkness. We saw complexity and assumed someone must have designed the whole thing. Those are reasonable instincts. They are also exactly the instincts that can mislead us. The completed structure compresses centuries into one object. It makes gradual change look like a single decision. An underground chamber, excavated for one reason, expanded for another, connected later, reused during a different period, and modified by another community, can appear to us as if it were created in one coherent act. History disappears. Architecture remains. Then architecture gets blamed for being mysterious. This is why uncertainty about Derinkuyu's earliest origins should not be treated as a flaw in the story. We genuinely do not know who cut the first spaces that eventually became part of the complex. Hittites have been proposed. Phrygians have been proposed. Other possibilities remain. The earliest chronology is difficult. We should leave it difficult. There is no historical responsibility in choosing whichever civilization makes the best thumbnail. What we can say is more interesting anyway. Whoever began cutting into the rock could not have known what Derinkuyu would eventually become. They could not have planned for every later community that used it. They could not have predicted every enemy. They did something useful. Someone else inherited it. Then history kept happening. That pattern is deeply human. We inherit solutions to problems we did not create. Sometimes the original problem disappears, but the solution remains because it has found another purpose. Sometimes we maintain a habit long after forgetting exactly why it began. Sometimes an old structure becomes useful again when circumstances unexpectedly resemble the past. And sometimes the physical thing survives so much longer than the explanation that future generations look at it and assume the explanation must have been extraordinary. Derinkuyu is extraordinary. The reason for it may have been much more ordinary. Repeated insecurity, repeated adaptation, repeated memory, repeated survival. There is no need to make those things more dramatic than they already are. Consider what survival actually meant after one of those periods underground. The stone door eventually moved. Someone approached the upper passages. Information arrived that the danger had passed, or enough time had gone by that people were willing to risk checking. Then the first inhabitants began climbing upward. They did not emerge into a triumphant ending. They emerged into work. Animals had to be taken out. Supplies had to be moved. Homes had to be checked. Damage had to be assessed. Fields still needed attention. Whatever had been lost had to be accepted or replaced. If someone had died, grief remained. If the settlement had escaped serious harm, relief did not plant the next crop. Ordinary life resumed because ordinary life is what survival is for. And after some time, the refuge became quiet again. That may be the image that best explains Derinkuyu. Not thousands of terrified people permanently trapped beneath the earth. An empty chamber, a lamp extinguished, a passage no longer crowded, a stone door standing open. Above it, people have returned to sunlight because there is work to do. The refuge remains available beneath them. Nobody knows when it will be needed again. Perhaps years will pass. Perhaps an entire generation. Eventually, a child who once descended holding an adult's hand becomes the adult who knows the route. The architecture stays almost the same. The people change. This continues until, eventually, the people change so completely that the route itself is forgotten. Today, we enter from the opposite direction. We go underground because Derinkuyu is interesting. They went underground because the surface was not. We look at the narrow corridors and wonder how anyone could tolerate them. They may have looked at the same corridor and felt relief. We see confinement. They could see distance from danger. We see darkness. They could see concealment. We see an enormous underground city and ask what terrible thing forced human beings to build it. And after following the story this far, we can give a quieter answer. Probably nothing did. Not one thing. Derinkuyu appears to be the result of many decisions made across a very long time by people responding to different circumstances in a landscape unusually suited to underground construction. Some of its earliest history remains uncertain. Later, Christian use and expansion are much clearer. Periods of warfare and raiding made refuge valuable. Successful refuge made preparation worth repeating. Repeated preparation made the underground more elaborate. And inherited architecture allowed later generations to respond to dangers its earliest builders could never have imagined. Fear began the journey underground. Experience made people return. Memory kept the passages useful. And time made the whole thing look like a mystery. There is one final thought worth carrying back toward the surface. We often judge historical people by the strangeness of the solutions they left behind. A wall seems excessive because the enemy is gone. A fortress seems enormous because the frontier disappeared. A granary seems obsessive because we are not living through the famine it was designed to prevent. And an underground city seems almost unimaginable because tonight, for most of us, the sky above our homes is not something we need to escape. The people of Derinkuyu did not have our advantage. Their architecture preserves the decisions made when the safer direction was sometimes down. So now, at the end of our journey, we can move upward again, past the rooms where food once waited, past the places where animals could be sheltered, past the wells and shafts that carried the essentials of life into a world without daylight, past the narrow corridors designed to make strangers slow down, past the circular stone doors that turned rock itself into a barrier, and eventually, toward the entrance. The air changes first, then the light. The underground begins to lose its grip on the senses, and the ordinary world returns. Cappadocia is still there. The volcanic landscape that made Derinkuyu possible stretches beneath an open sky. Villages, roads, fields, and the strange shapes of weathered rock occupy the surface, just as human life has always preferred to do. Beneath it, the chambers remain. They no longer need to hide anyone. There is no warning moving from village to village, no family deciding what it can carry, no livestock being guided toward an entrance, no reason to roll the stone door shut. And perhaps that is the calmest way to leave Derinkuyu. Not with a solved mystery, because parts of its history remain genuinely uncertain, not with a forgotten apocalypse, not with a secret civilization, simply with an old human solution still resting beneath the ground long after the emergencies that gave it meaning have passed. For the people who once depended on it, the most beautiful thing about Derinkuyu may never have been the city itself. It was the moment they no longer needed it. The door could open, and they could go home,